Andy, Bayern, well, what can we say, eh? I'm not sure how much of a surprise it was that they beat PSG 2-1, but maybe the big surprise is this is the 16th win out of 16 in competitive games this season. They're on a roll.
Yeah, I mean, it's even for a club with their history of domination and a team with their history of domination in the last decade plus, this is something else. And I think even if you won 15 out of 15, to go to the home of the Champions League holders and play like they did, particularly in the first half, and win the game is something special. There's no doubt about that. But I think there are little clues in how they were going to approach this. Going back to last weekend, remember they played Bayer Leverkusen at the weekend, in which would be seen as one of the defining games of the Bundesliga season in the last couple of seasons. Obviously, we know that Leverkusen are in a state of profound reconstruction, but I think that Vincent Kompany approached that game with Harry Kane, Luis Diaz, Michael Olise in the bench. I think says a lot. The fact that he was saving it all for this game at PSG. Now, look, it may not be like, do or die because we're just in the league stage, but I think we can underestimate how much to teams of this stature a game like this matters at this stage. There's a really good chance to measure yourself against opposition which you would consider truly worthy, a lot of which you don't face in most weeks. For both teams, this was a step up from the teams they face most weeks, not just domestically, but in the Champions League too. So it was interesting hearing Kompany after that game against Leverkusen going, yeah, it's going to be rock and roll. And I thought, wow, you don't expect him to come out with something like that. But he was so enthused about it. Luis Enrique was so enthused about it. But everything that Bayern did in the lead up, like retrospectively, I think maybe persuaded you that something like this was coming.
Yeah, Lars, what a gent Andy is, because he's left you to tell us just how really impressive this victory over PSG was. How many men Bayern were playing with during much of the game, and also let's not forget PSG have been the team to beat all season. We thought.
Yeah, so I think that's what makes this result really interesting for me. Not just that Bayern won, but that Bayern had to play an entire half with 10 men against what we would describe as one of the best, possibly the best attacking teams in the world. I think that's not an outrageous thing to say about PSG. And they were pummeled in that second half, let's be fair. Like, I think the PSG had 19 shots to 2 or something, but they held on. And that's what seems like a change for me. Because Bayern have had this thing the last few years where, well, obviously not they didn't win the league, but they were good in the Bundesliga. And I think like the modern, like sort of 5, 6, 7 years, they've often been good in the Bundesliga. But they've often had a rick in them at the back, and there's often been like a bit of softness and uncertainty in the defense. Me, as someone who enjoys indulging in a bit of betting occasionally, Bayern to win and both teams to score is often a go-to place to go, because like they're good, but they'll sometimes you don't really trust that defense to keep a clean sheet. That's been a thing. Now this season they have looked a little bit more solid. I think Jonathan Tah takes a lot of credit for that. I think with him, and I think he's a better match for Upamecano than some of the other partners Upamecano has had at the back. I think he's a kind of a calming presence, whereas Upamecano is a little bit frantic at times. And the fact that they went away to PSG and held out for an entire half with 10 men, that feels like a genuinely new and different thing.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it, Lars? That it was two very distinct halves. It felt to me that Bayern were very superior in the first half. And then after the Luis Diaz scoring those 2 goals and then getting sent off on the brink of half time for that really quite awful tackle on Achraf Hakimi that's put him out for a number of weeks, that they had to do the other side of it. So they kind of had to play 2 games in the one night, really. If they were, if you look at like a league stage game as a glorified training exercise, which I think is a bit of a harsh interpretation, but if we're talking about it for the purposes of this, it would have been, this is training in one very distinct discipline, and this is training in another very distinct discipline. Yeah. I think the important thing to say as well, when you were talking about Upamecano, Well, firstly, about Tar and Upamecano. With Tar, there was a bit where it looked like, with all the injuries that PSG picked up that night, that Kvaratskhelia might be done because the whole weight of Tar landed on him. And sort of, you realise at that point what a unit that Jonathan Tar is, in case you've forgotten. The other thing that I didn't mention when we were talking about them leaving out, or Kompany leaving out Kane and Olise and Luis Diaz before this game, he left out Upamecano as well against Leverkusen, which I think is also quite noteworthy and might have slipped under the radar a little.
Yeah. Does this mean then, Lars, that it's Bayern that are the front runners in the Champions League? Are they the team to beat?
They're one of them, that's for sure. And I think I've always been a little suspicious of Bayern when we get to the latter stages, when they come up against the very best teams, because as much as they are fabulous going forward, there's been the softness to them. And this sort of result, at the risk of repeating myself, makes me think that maybe they are for real this season. And I think that's what gives that's what makes this kind of game interesting. And there is also this thing that Kimmich spoke about before the game, actually, about how there is there's more of a team ethos here. He talked about how when he arrived 10 years ago, the team had 23, 24, 25 world-class players, as he said. But when he sees now, and I can quote him directly, I've got the line here, but when I see now how we function as a team and how we rejoice with and for each other, when I see the way we bring principles onto the pitch, how one runs for the other, then that's already very special. So it's more of a team maybe than it was a few years ago when they had maybe more star powers in the squad.
And that is all Kompany, actually, I think. It's not just the players. I think it's the atmosphere that he creates. And you talked about it before, Lars. I think in a tactical sense, someone who, like when you think the defensive failings that you talked about before, something that bedeviled the end of Hansi Flick's reign, which Nagelsmann could never sort out, which Tuchel could never sort out. And, we could sit here and say it's recruitment, and to an extent that's true. But if you look at what they've got on paper at the moment, they've not really got two proper fullbacks. They've got guys who are filling in at fullback. So I think that says a lot for the team as a whole. But there is this sense that Kompany, and part of the reason they've extended his contract recently to 2029, is the fact that he has actually changed the culture of Bayern a bit, which is remarkable when you consider he was like, 8th, 9th choice to get the job. But he's come in and created this very adult, grown up, holistic. It's not, who's got the loudest voice and the shortest shorts gets heard. It's something different now. It feels like togetherness and respect, less drama, which is something that he's very strong on. I think the influence of Kompany and actually the off-field influence of Harry Kane, like him being a totem and him being the opposite of a dramatist, the opposite of a prima donna. I think those two things are really important for the culture of this Bayern.
I actually want to. You refer to him as not a proper fullback, and I guess you're right. Konrad Laimer, not a traditional right back, but I do think he is part of the secret sauce here for them this season, in a similar way that, like, Valverde at Real Madrid doesn't want to play right back, but it's extremely useful when he does, because you have someone who is essentially a central midfielder who just has an unbelievable engine that you can put in that position, and he's got the juice to get up and down the flank if you want him to go on the overlap. He can come inside in the midfield and help the midfield, if you will, and he has the legs to get back as well. And it's one of those things that just solves a lot of issues for the coach around the field, to have a guy who's essentially covering more than just his position.
I guess the question is, does that work? You were talking about the back end of the Champions League, and that's the question, isn't it? Because when you before were talking about, does this make Bayern the favourites? I think being a November favourite and being a March favourite is way different. And I think it's fine to ask a Bayern a genuine contender. And like Lars says, definitely, yes. But in terms of, like, if we go back to the league phase last season, Liverpool were unbelievable. Like, I don't think, even though they had some huge results in the league stage, as I said at the time, the results didn't really describe exactly how good Liverpool are. And I kind of feel the same about Bayern at the moment. It takes a game like this to make everyone stand up and go, wow, they are seriously good. But actually, if you've been watching them all season, have been building up to something like this because they have been so good. Those 15, now 16 successive wins haven't really properly defined quite how good they are and in what way they've been so good. But for all that Liverpool did in the league stage and the fact they look like the best team in Europe, they draw PSG in the last 16 and all of a sudden it's all over. So that's the beauty of this Champions League, really. You can't really know what this means in terms of the competition as a whole, as Lars was looking forward to.
But Andy, I feel like you are letting the cat out of the bag a little bit here by saying that essentially very little that happens in the league phase matters. For us, whose part of our livelihood, Andy, is creating content, talking about this stuff. Come on, that's the secret. We don't want people to really, come on. But, no, I think there is something to that about how, like, it doesn't, on one hand, it really doesn't matter what happens in the league stage, as long as you get out. And if you're one of the big boys, you want to be in the top 8. Like, it does matter to not have to do the extra qualifying round. This is true.
Yeah, big time.
And then it all comes down to, in the same way that, like, World Cups are like, it's a 4-year cycle. Really, all it comes down to is, like, the quarters and the semis, and all the stuff before is just kind of bad. But I would still go back to the fact that I think this team showed us something about Bayern that we didn't quite know before. Because I know you cover the Bundesliga closely. I know you watch them every weekend, Andy. But I still have this sort of, it's just the Bundesliga though, innit? Like there is a sort of sense of like, is this actually repeatable against the very best on the continent? And I do think holding on with 10 men against PSG away from home for a full half tells you, okay, there is a solidity in this team that hasn't been there before in a good while.
You see, I find it so compelling what you were saying, Andy, earlier on about the way that Vincent Kompany manages the players. You know, there are so many different types of coaches. You've got the tacticians, you know, you've got the exercise freaks, but you also have the man managers. And Kompany, crucially, after his Man City days, or maybe even during that, he went and did a business degree, I seem to remember. And one of the most, or the pillar stones of certainly economic philosophies, a guy called J.K. Galbraith, an American philosopher. He said, look, your biggest asset, your greatest asset, it's them, the people that work for you. And I wonder if Vincent Kompany has realized that that's his skill. You know, if he is as good as you say he is, taking on this Bayern team, even though he wasn't the obvious choice for it, maybe he's discovered something about how he approaches coaching as well, that, you know, stick to what you know best and let other people who've got more expertise in other areas concentrate on that.
Yeah, I think he always has had an understanding of his limitations as well as his strengths. And I think that's really important. That's something I guess we very rarely see of coaches, because so much of being a coach is my personal brand and my philosophy, and this is how I see things, which I guess is why people find it so hard to get a handle on, say, a Zidane or an Ancelotti as a coach, because they're not sort of talking constantly about themselves and, you know, their view of the game, which I guess leaves a sort of vacuum where people say, oh, have you got a philosophy? You know, aren't you just a, you know, ego stroker or whatever, which is not the case. I don't think with either of those coaches. No, I think people will have the same issue defining Kompany. But the thing that interests me about him, like following on from what you were saying, Don, is the fact that he is someone who, rather than feeling that he has to justify failure and saying, oh, this is why it didn't work here, I didn't have that resource. You know, he went back to Anderlecht and really faced an impossible job. A club that meant a lot to him, and a club that is massive in Belgium, where there's an incredible amount of scrutiny. And the fact that he struggled there, and the fact that he had a difficult time in the top flight with Burnley, it seems to me that the way that Kompany is looking at that is, we tend to look at coaches' failures or coaches' setbacks, I suppose, as something that should define them. Like maybe they're not a good coach, rather than thinking that's something that actually adds to making you a better coach in the future. And it feels like everything he's learned along the way, that's the way he sees it. He's not trying to cover his arse or justify what happened before. He's saying, well, actually, maybe those difficult bits made me that coach that I am now, and maybe the difficult bits here will continue to make me better.
Lars, what are we to say about PSG then, who are the other side of this coin? I mean, it takes two to tango, and they're the losing side against 10-man Bayern Munich. And we're talking about the champions here, or, well, for how long?
Well, yeah, they've had a couple of games now. Only scored one against Lorient, only scored one against Nice, and only scored one here. So, I mean, by their standards, that is a drought. But their standards are very, very high. I mean, maybe this is a cop out on my side. I think it's a long season, and you can't be scoring 5, 6, 7 goals in every single game. I do wonder if we're poking holes in this team. I think there's something. Maybe this is me being too much of a traditionalist, but Luis Enrique's skepticism of traditional centre forwards is something that I wonder about. Now, I'm aware that Gonzalo Ramos came on here for the last sort of almost half hour and didn't, wasn't the solution to everything. But there is something about playing with essentially 3 wingers up front. When you have a game state where you're pushing against someone who's sitting deep, those wingers are going to get the space to run into. So maybe that is an area where they could improve. I'm not saying they need Duncan Ferguson in the box to put crosses into. But I do wonder if, I mean,
we're in the realms of fantasy football now.
Yeah. I like, call me a traditionalist. I like my big number 9. Maybe I've been Holland pilled, but I like the idea of having an option in the squad. Even like Joselu was for Real Madrid for a little while. Like, as daft as that looked, it kind of worked for them. Like, it's a good idea, I think, to have a striker who's 6 foot something for when the game just devolves into you trying to knock down a door, and that door is well organized and your dribbly wingers don't have the space. I would listen, they won many things last year without it. They were fine, but I just wonder if that is a tool that would have been a nice thing for them to have in the toolbox.
I'll tell you what, Lars, I think what this game proved, and the second half of this game proved, is how much they've missed João Neves over the last couple of weeks when he's been injured. When you talk about an opener-upperer in the centre of midfield, I guess we always think it has to be a Xavi Simons. Or a player like that. It has to be an orthodox number 10. I don't know if it does, because João Neves is developing. We already knew he was brilliant. We already knew he could do the defensive side of the game. We already knew he had an enviable range of passing from sort of number 6 or a number 8 position. But what we've been seeing from him at the start of the season, you think of that hat-trick he scored against Toulouse, which is, as JJ was saying, going back a couple of months on the pod, one of the best hat-tricks you'll ever seen, like better than Rivaldo against Valencia kind of hat-trick. The technical quality of him is unbelievable. And when he was making those runs late into the box, that was the bit where Bayern looked in proper danger. And I think in a season where, and we've seen it not just with the injuries that picked up against Bayern, but the way that the whole season has gone for PSG, the physical load on them has kind of been unbearable, and we can't know when these injuries are going to happen throughout the season. That's why it's so hard to predict, Dotun, where PSG are going to end up, because we don't know. If we say now, like, we don't know where Bayern are going to be in March compared to November, I think that's even more difficult to predict with PSG, because you don't know when the physical overload is going to hit them, or is going to hit certain key players. So I think in all the players that you think, can they do without this guy? Well, maybe they can do without this guy for 2-3 weeks. Can they do without Dembele? They can do without him for a couple of weeks. That is fine. They'll find a way to cover. It's felt to me that this game really brought into focus for me like how much they'd missed João Neves, and of all the players they need to keep fit, I think he's one of the most important ones.
You know that song, The Kids Are All Right? My question is, well, are they all right in top level football when they're indispensable? I don't know if you've been following the news. I'm sure you both have. The reports from Spain at least suggest that Barcelona are looking, or the reports from Spain before Barcelona faced Club Bruges were that the club was looking to protect Lamine Yamal, their mercurial youngster, because he's playing a lot, and youngsters, well, their muscles are still growing and all of that sort of stuff. And then we saw him against Club Bruges, and we realised just how indispensable he is to this Barcelona side. Lars, are the kids all right playing as much, and particularly Lamine Yamal? What have you seen about the level of intensity, I suppose, in using him over and over again? Is he suffering?
I mean, the concern is that you overload him with stuff, and he has had a couple of little injuries, and I think it's more of a broad issue. I don't think it's healthy for an institution the size of Barcelona, with the cultural footprint they have, with the pressure that comes with it, to look to a guy who's 18 now, turned 18 this summer, and say, you are the guy who's going to have to win games for us. I don't think that's good for him in a lot of ways, in terms of the physical demands of him having to play almost every game for him, and also the mental burden that comes with that. I don't think that's great. And I think we already have an example at Barcelona of Pedri, who is probably, I mean, I'm not a sports scientist, I'm not a fitness expert, surprisingly, but Pedri, a player who probably played too many games when he was young and has had a lot of injury issues since. It's something that Barcelona, I think, in my opinion, I would like to see them get a little better at managing, because it's like a double-edged sword with the La Masia thing. Like, every single generation, they churn out a couple of players who become global superstars. They never seem to miss. But that does mean the team sometimes end up relying, maybe too heavily, on very young guys. And I do wonder sometimes if the club needs to be a little bit stronger and say that, okay, these are important players, but we need to save them a little bit and protect them from this workload.
Andy, your thoughts on this? Because I although most of us would agree with what Lars says, you got a valuable asset, you got to protect it as much as you can. However, I wonder, even despite his baby face, I wonder if Lamine Yamal, if the coach comes up to him and says, you're the guy we're relying on, in the way that Lars said it, to win our games for him, that youngster is going to say, oh, great, brilliant. Yeah, I'm happy to do it every single week. And I wonder whether sometimes we judge youthful players as being like every other teenager of their age, whereas actually they're quite grown up, aren't they, these guys?
Beyond grown up. And I think that's always been the thing with Lamine Yamal. It's not just that his talent's so persuasive, it's that his demeanour is as well. His demeanour, not just to take responsibility, because all talented young players want the ball. But as we've said from the very beginning, the way he plays is really reminiscent of someone in their absolute peak in their late 20s. And I think the biggest danger is to forget how young he is. Now, I think some of the most valuable moments for Barcelona have been some of those little moments, or in the medium term will be some of those moments where we've been reminded that he is still 18. So whether that's insouciance when he's playing, whether that's the birthday party that's been talked about forever, whether that's him losing his passport when Spain were playing away in Turkey, and he's there sort of bent over his little carry-on suitcase outside the team coach searching through it. I love all those bits because they remind us that he is actually a young man who's capable of football, because his consistency, we're not just talking about a young player showing potential, his relentless consistency in the last year and a half or so, it's just uncommon. We can't compare him to other talented young players, even the most talented young players, because he is as good as it gets. He is beyond generational, really. And that's the problem, because the reason they're having this discussion in Spain at the moment is of do we need to give him a rest? And Lars is absolutely right. They do. They do need to look after him if they want him to be the player he is and more at 26, 27 that he is now. Because you can't keep going to the bank and expect there to still be money in there. I think that the fact is that the conversation started because of the way he played in El Clasico, because he ran his mouth beforehand and didn't back it up in the game. And then you have these other games that follow where there's not quite that explosiveness that there normally is from him. And he fluctuates during the game. And normally he's the best player for the whole 90 minutes. He runs the game for the whole 90 minutes. And that hasn't happened in recent weeks. And now, if we're looking at medium-term Barcelona, that he goes and scores a goal like he scores against Club Brugge, where you're like, yeah, we need to rest him. Oh, yeah, actually, we can't rest him, can we? Because he's footballing Jesus. There's nothing we can do about it. He's just, his talent is so persuasive, it makes it a real catch-22.
Yeah, I mean, just so listeners know specifically what we're talking about, this is a guy who turned 18 a couple of months ago. He's already had 80 appearances in La Liga and 26 in the Champions League. Like, that's absurd, really, for a player that age.
It's unreal.
And it's something that, and increasingly, it's not just coming off the bench. It's not just playing. He is the guy that you rely on, the guy that you turn to. And I worry a little bit about that. I think, and it's something that, it's a weird dynamic with Barcelona, who a couple of years started making these absolutely desperate financial maneuvers to try to stay competitive, to try to keep pace. They will say that they're trying to keep pace with the Premier League clubs, but of course the reality is they're trying to keep pace with Real Madrid. That's the most important thing for them. And they've been pulling increasing numbers of desperate levers and selling off their future for the sake of the presents, to bring in expensive players. But the thing that's ended up carrying the team through this period has been the kids from the academy. It's been Pedri, it's been Gavi, it's been Cubarsí, it's been all these guys, and Yamal. And I think really one way to look at this discussion is these guys that they brought in at tremendous expense should actually be doing more, so that they wouldn't be quite so reliant on the babies, no?
Yeah, well, I guess it's funny because everyone looked at, and we've mentioned this before, but everyone looked at Deco, the sporting director, when he said in the summer, our priority is not to, as people who watch the Champions League semi-final and casual watchers of Barcelona said last season, get more defenders or get better defenders. Well, I don't think it's that simple, but a lot of people said that. And Deco said the priority is cover for Rafinha and Lamine Yamal, because we just lean on them too heavily. Now, funnily enough, because that's been proven right in the sense that obviously they've got Marcus Rashford, and he's been great, and he's been really needed because Rafinha's been injured for a while. But on the other hand, the injury to Rafinha and the fact that they haven't got a massive squad has meant that they've had to totally lean on Rashford, and they haven't been able to give Lamine Yamal a rest. Because really, I suppose ideally at this point, you would be bringing back in Rafinha, and maybe they can do that in a couple of weeks. Bring back in Rafinha, keep Rashford in the team, and give Lamine Yamal a bit of a breather. But if you're looking elsewhere in the front line at the moment, Lewandowski's had his problems, so you've got Ferran Torres playing, and they see him as a centre-forward. They don't see him as a wide player anyway. And who's your other forward? Joe Fernandes, who again is someone who you see him and you're like, oh my God, I want him to play every game. And he's 17, so you can't. So, I mean, you're right, Lars. It's like partly their financial reality, but I guess it does show that given what they've got, Deco is doing absolutely the best job possible to try and protect the players that need to be protected.
I know, Andy, you've got a theory about, the fantasy football of the future as the game gets faster and faster and faster. Well, you tell us, because I found it quite a fascinating theory. Okay, maybe there will be some smirks and some smiles at the theory, but I think there's something in this.
Well, this was like chat over cornflakes, really, wasn't it? I floated the idea, sort of semi-seriously, that in the future, like, football won't really be played by players in their mid-20s. It will be all teenagers, like players from like 15 to 21, 22, and really old guys, sort of who are like the coxes in a rowing team. So essentially, you've got, I don't know, Lamine Yamal, Max Dowman at one end, and you've got Luka Modric at the other end, as football becomes an increasingly physical game and the schedule's unbearable. So who are the players who are not going to complain about it and who can maybe physically deal with it? The younger players, I suppose. I mean, leaning into this a little bit, Lars, or leaning into, I guess, the reality of how it is for those young players. I mean, you talked about the numbers for Lamine Yamal, which are mad. I think it's worth bringing in some of the other ones, like Haaland, who's played, 350 senior games at 25. Jude Bellingham has played approaching 300 senior games, and he's 22. He turned 22 in June. Bradley Barcola, who there's been a lot of talk about his inconsistency over the last little while, and we're talking about the brilliant front players that PSG have. I mean, a lot of people are slating Barcola for his lack of productivity, his lack of finishing. He's played 90 games in 15 months. I mean, I don't know how you're meant to find clarity or consistency when you've got that. And again, if we take it back to Lamine Yamal, that's what makes his consistency on the whole even more remarkable.
Yeah, there's only one question mark with regards to Andy's theory, Lars, which is that he mentioned Luka Modric. And unfortunately, Luka Modric is the player that proves that you can still come out of it looking fresh.
Well, my theory goes in a slightly different direction than Andy's, because I think the nature of the way the game is played at the highest level is going to change. I think that's the thing that's going to happen because of this increased workload, because there's less time to rest for players. I think this period we've had when initially through Guardiola and also through the influence of various sort of Bielsa followers and then also the sort of German gegenpressing school of football, we've gone through a period where like the high press was the thing. Like that was the orthodoxy. That was you have to play with an aggressive high press and a high line to be successful. I think we're already seeing a slight readjustment to that. I think we're already seeing a team like Manchester City, coached by Pep Guardiola, of all people, decide that we're actually not going to do that anymore. We're going to sit back quite a lot more, partially to free up space for Erling to run into, sure, but also because I think more and more coaches think we can't ask the guys to do that 60 games a year. Like it doesn't work. And if it works, it doesn't work for very long. Even with more substitutions, even with bigger squads, it just isn't a viable way to play over longer periods of time. So I think the way the game is played itself will adjust to this this reality of the schedule right now.
I mean, I don't know if I'm taking a bit of a leap assuming that Jose Mourinho is a listener, but he has got this in his AirPods at the moment thinking, see, I'm back in fashion.
I stayed at the same hotel in Manchester that Jose Mourinho stayed in all the time whilst he was coach of Manchester United. You can go to Manchester and just say, take me to the Jose Mourinho hotel, to the cabin, and you will get... It's true.
That's a legacy. The Portuguese Alan Partridge. Do you think he had a big plate at the buffet?
It was a nice hotel. It was a nice hotel, I'll tell you that. Moving on, Galatasaray's impressive victory over Ajax, 3-0. Shouldn't have been a surprise to you, Andy, should it?
Well, I guess the win over Ajax in isolation, no, because Ajax, as we recently discussed on here, are absolutely in the mud at the moment. But I think what's really impressive is Galatasaray. And since that 5-1 defeat at Eintracht Frankfurt on the opening night, we think, oh, here we go again. A team that has proved again and again that they've really got no equal in the Turkish Super League, and they've built up an enviable squad. I can't get it right on the big nights in the Champions League. They can show promise and then it all falls to bits. And the way it fell apart in Frankfurt on the opening night was really alarming. But I think it's almost like Leeds 4-0 defeat in Barcelona going back to 2000, 2001. Do you remember when they got to the semi-finals? The opening night humiliation that said, right, okay, let's get the big boy pants on. And since then, 3 successive wins, obviously the one against Liverpool, and not just the fact that they beat Liverpool, but the way that they beat Liverpool, the maturity that they showed has really allowed them to move on from here. I guess like the obvious headline, Lars, is the fact that Victor Osimhen is doing what Victor Osimhen was always meant to do: score a ton of goals for Galatasaray in the Champions League and look absolutely unplayable. But I think the way that they've the way that they've managed games in these last three fixtures has been really interesting. If we're looking at them as, well, now we have to look at them as a possible contender for the top 8, I think, because they're in ninth at the moment, and only out of the top 8 on goal difference.
Yeah, for me, as someone who's not more of a casual observer of Turkish football, I don't know it as in-depth as you do, as the listeners will appreciate. There are two things that I think about with Galatasaray. The first thing is, in this game against Ajax, Ajax are terrible at the moment, and Heitinga is going to get fired any minute, but you watch the first goal, and it's Leroy Sané hitting in a brilliant cross for Osimhen, who makes a really clever movement, stays onside, scores. And you're just thinking, these are superstars, these two. You know, Leroy Sané, okay, can be inconsistent, but he's just 29. Like, he's not 35. He's someone who still has the talent and the skill to play for one of the very, very, very biggest clubs in Europe. And they've managed to entice him to go to Istanbul. And Osimhen the same. Osimhen could play centre forward for almost any team in Europe. Like, he would improve. I'm not sure there's, maybe City because they already have Erling. Maybe Real Madrid because I'm not sure how him and Mbappe would work together. Maybe Barcelona because Lewandowski has a little bit of gas left in the tank, and maybe Bayern because Harry Kane's brilliant. But aside from those, I think Osimhen would improve every team in the world, and he's at Galatasaray. Like that, and that feels like a change. Like this is not just them. There's them using this enormous status that they have in Turkey and the genuine financial muscles they somehow seem to have. I don't quite understand how that works under the hood, but it apparently does work. And attracting players who, like, this is not retirement league stuff anymore in the way it was in the past, when maybe like they've had someone like Wesley Sneijder go there, they've had Didier Drogba go there, but at a slightly different stage of their careers, I think it's fair to say. These are superstars right now who are there. And the other thing I would like to say about Galatasaray is that game against Liverpool, I did not think they had in them at all, because we went... we've seen them plenty of times. Like, this is a team that is geared towards absolutely thumping teams in the Turkish league in front of that very enthusiastic audience that they have, who can play good attacking football. But they've been a bit wild. I mean, we've said this on the pod before. Lucas Torreira is the guy who's the adult in the room in midfield. It's not what you want, really, when you're playing against very, very good teams. So when they actually managed to hold Liverpool and be defensively solid, and as you said, Andy, mature in that game, that kind of gets my attention, because that's not... I'm not surprised they've beaten Bodo Glimt on a day when Bodo Glimt were not great. I'm not surprised they've beaten an Ajax team that is kind of disintegrating before our eyes, and surely Johnny Heitinga cannot stay on there for much longer. These things are not surprising to me. But holding Liverpool, even a Liverpool in semi-crisis, I think is a very, very big surprise. And I do wonder if maybe this is the year Galatasaray mean business in Europe.
Yeah, I think Lars makes a compelling argument, though, that Galatasaray aren't the whipping boys. They shouldn't be, not with the superstars that they've got. You know, Victor Osimhen is the leading scorer in the Champions League at the moment. However, when they faced Monaco and Atletico Madrid, are they facing those two teams at the right time then, Andy? Because, you know, those two teams haven't quite fired off themselves for them to progress further.
Well, before that, they have Union Saint-Gilloise in Istanbul, who you would expect them to put away. They win that, they're up to 12 points. And at that point, you're really playing with house money. I think they can go and win in Monaco, which would be the next match after that. And then, as you say, Atletico Madrid will not fancy a trip to Rams Park. They just won't. And then that last game that Galatasaray have away at Manchester City, like, who knows what team City put out? Because I would imagine that City are going to be home and hosed by then. So I think it looks really, really good for them. But I think in terms of once they've got that 12 points in the bag, that they're in a position where the fear of failure is removed. Because that, I feel, is what has been the case for Galatasaray in previous times in the Champions League. And remember, they haven't been in the Champions League frequently in the last 5 or 6 years. You know, there was no Turkish team in the Champions League at all last season, because they went out in the playoff round against Young Boys, which was pretty disastrous for them, especially after the transfer window that they were having. And then the season before, they entertained us against Manchester United twice, and yet them and United both got edged out by Copenhagen in the end. So, which looks even more remarkable when you look at this week's results and where Copenhagen were at against Tottenham, even though clearly they've got a lot of injuries at the moment and a weaker team than that they did have 2 years ago. So I think it is the most important thing, that sense of confidence that comes from being able to manage the games. I mean, Lars is absolutely right in that the Liverpool game is a marker. But I would go to that game against Bodo Glimt as well, because you look at that and they go 3-0 up, fine. And then they concede one goal and there's a little bit of a wobble, but they manage to sort it out. And I think when you go back a couple of seasons, when they last qualified for the Champions League, in the playoff round against Molde, they were really lucky. They looked all over the place for a lot of that game. Even though they've got better players, like a lot better players, and a humongous budget compared to Molde. You know, they nearly made a proper mess of it. I think you look at the game that we went when we went and did our film for the OTC YouTube last season, Lars. They're playing a Dynamo Kiev team who've got far lesser resources than them. They're all over them, and they managed to not win the game, despite the fact they have like 4 or 5 times as many chances. Yeah. And I think really we can kind of underrate the coach here, Okan Buruk, who I really rate, who's got a reputation for really attacking football. But I think the thing that we have to remember about Okan Buruk is when he was playing for Inter in his playing career, because he is someone who is a lot more cosmopolitan than a lot of giants of Turkish football. I think you're really starting to see that, actually. Maybe this is the point that he starts to say, okay, this is a squad of really good players. And as you say, some of those players are top-level players in their prime, which has maybe not been a feature of Turkish football in the past. But maybe Buruk is the man to govern them. And maybe this will make clubs think twice in the future when they could go and get a Jose Mourinho or someone like that. That actually having someone who knows the league, but is someone who's a little bit more worldly as well, kind of helps.
Yeah. This whole segment, Andy, is making me think I need to go back to Istanbul and watch football again.
I mean, let's eat as well. Let's
do it. Let's do a repeat of our trip next year at some point. It's
and
got to
don't
happen,
forget
Andy.
your friends back home, yeah, when it comes to eating.
You're invited, Dotun. You can come to Istanbul with us.
Just bring back the halva as you did last time. We'll be happy.
Tremendous.
Okay, thank you both on those subjects, but let's remind listeners of the game of the week that we recommended last week. We always look back on the game of the week. Tomorrow on Ask OTC, you both will kindly recommend games of the week for us to watch this weekend. But last week, Andy, crucially, David Cartilage picked Leipzig versus Stuttgart. That was a game made for you, wasn't it?
I like the way he picked as he felt I would have picked. I'm very on board with that. Look, it was well worth it as a game. Stuttgart, as we've established, maybe Vincent Kompany's changing our view of this, but I would have said in recent times, Stuttgart have the best coach in the Bundesliga in Sebastian Hoeneß, who I do think will end up being Bayern coach at some point. Stuttgart have been super impressive so far this season, but Leipzig looking really, really good at the moment. They dominated this; they were well worth the win.
And Lars, Nicky picked AC Milan versus Roma.
Yeah, not a bad pick, even though it was just 1-0 in the end. It was, Milan had 17 shots to Roma's 20, so it was a fairly eventful affair. It was one of those games where you start to wonder about, it's been weird with Roma so far under Gasperini, because when Gasperini goes to Roma, you're just thinking, okay, Gasperini's working on a slightly bigger budget, big city, maybe he's going to unleash, and it's going to be because Gasperini's teams have always been exciting and attacking. But the story of them so far has been that they haven't been attacking well at all. And for this game, Artem Dobvik dropped with the Sule and Dybala starting against dual false nines up front. And yeah, they created chances, but no goals. And this is what Roma. They've still started okay. They're near the right end of the table, but it's not quite been the Gasperini team we were hoping or expecting for so far.